Hi, so this is the second part of our definitions of abnormality lessons. This is Psychopathology, Paper 1, Definitions of Abnormality. Last lesson we looked at deviation from social norms and statistical infrequency. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video and try and write a definition for each of these keywords. Okay, so you can look back at your notes from the last lesson and you can check your definitions. Things that you must have within your definitions, so deviation from social norms, you must have the idea that someone is deviating from what is seen as normal in society, and this can be bound by laws or culture or religion, and it has to be a behaviour that we see as being unusual or quite worrying. Then statistical infrequency, this is a behaviour that is less common or rare, so we used IQ as our example, and people who were 2 or more standard deviations from the mean, so towards the tail ends of the bell curves, if they had a really low IQ or a really high IQ, that behaviour was rare, so we would see that person as potentially being abnormal, and we might want to investigate that further. Right, so we've got 4 definitions of abnormality. 2 that we did last lesson, statistical infrequency, which is sometimes called statistical deviation, but it means the same thing, and deviation from social norms. In today's lesson, we're going to look at failure to function adequately and ideal mental health. Failure to function adequately. Pause this, make some notes, but I'll talk through it. This is when someone is behaving in a way that impacts their daily life, okay, and they can't function. So it's someone who's struggling to cope with day-to-day living. An example of this would be someone who's struggling to eat, to sleep, or even to get out of bed. So people who are suffering from depression often fall under this category because they find it very, very difficult to get up. They have changes in their eating behaviour and their sleep patterns. Some of them, insomnia is quite common if you're suffering from depression, and lots of people who are suffering from depression say that their day-to-day life is kind of like struggling and walking through treacle, like everything is a real effort and it's really, really difficult for them to do normal daily things. So what you need to remember for your definition of failure to function adequately is it is when someone cannot cope with day-to-day living, okay? And you'll need to have a little example of that. So for example, someone who is suffering from depression may find it very difficult to do daily tasks such as getting out of bed, washing and eating meals. So our example is the idea of depression. There's a celebrity example here, so we've got Frankie Bridge. She was suffering from depression, and a few years ago she spoke about this in the media, so you can find lots and lots of clips on YouTube about this, lots and lots of articles. I've got a statement from an article on BBC News, and she said that she couldn't cope with everyday life. So it fits in with failure to function adequately really well. Failure to function adequately is a really good way of diagnosing someone who is suffering with depression. She even wrote a book about it, so you can have a little look at that if you wish to do so. So in evaluation, again, pause the video, make some notes, but I'll talk through it. Failure to function adequately. When we're evaluating this, there's 3 things that we need to consider. So the first one is who judges. So someone has to decide what adequate is, okay? This could be a family member, because you might not realise yourself that you are failing to function, so somebody else might have to highlight that to you. It could be the psychiatrist that decides what adequate is, and they will use that in terms of their definition. It says on the PowerPoint, you can see that many schizophrenics do not feel that they have a problem. Okay, so they're not, lots of people are unaware that they are not coping. They just go about their day-to-day routine, which is often very different to other people's day-to-day routine. So they might see that they're functioning perfectly fine, and like I said, it might have to be a family member who judges that you are failing to function adequately. Next, we've got cultural relativism. So again, like deviation from social norms from last lesson, it's really important to take into account the cultural background of the individual when we're using this as our definition of abnormality. Because what is adequate is different across cultures. Collectivist cultures have a very we-centred attitude, and their cultural norms are to be with other people, to share your income, to share your house with your extended family members, to ask for support and to work together in teams. Whereas in individualistic cultures such as like the UK and the USA, we're very me-centred, so we are kind of like out for ourselves, and if you are to be successful you have to work as an individual, and you have to live on your own, have your own income, etc. So if someone's coming from a collectivist culture to an individualistic culture, they might find it very difficult because the norms of society and what is expected as being able to function adequately is very different. So often they might be misdiagnosed, or they might be more likely to be diagnosed with a disorder than other individuals who are from that culture or that cultural background. When we're talking about cultural background as well, it doesn't just have to be different places in the world, it can also be within a culture. So lower class individuals have a very different culture to people of a higher class. So often lower class people are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia because it's upper class people who are deciding what is adequate, and these upper class people are judging the lower class people based on what they see as adequacy. Okay, and then our final thing that we need to consider with regards to evaluation is exceptions to the rule. So some individuals may be suffering from an illness and people just don't pick up on it because they're very good at hiding this, or people just think that they're a little bit quirky. So John Forbes Nash is a very good example. There's a film about him, A Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe. It's very interesting, and there's lots of articles that you can find about him and his background, and lots of videos on YouTube. So he's a mathematician from America who was suffering from schizophrenia. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. It actually wasn't picked up for a very long time. People just thought he was quirky and a bit of an individual, but he actually had a serious mental illness and he just wasn't picked up. So sometimes failure to function adequately, it's not the best definition of abnormality because it's very hard to miss people and misinterpret their behaviours. So when we're evaluating failure to function adequately, we need to remember that someone must decide what failing is. So this is the person that judges, and often it isn't the individual who is actually suffering from the disorder. Next, what is adequate differs across culture. So that can be different places in the world, or it can also be within a culture, so upper class and lower class, and we need to take that into account. Like I said last lesson, the DSM, the more recent version, actually has questionnaires that take into account culture. So that's a really good thing. So even though we need to take into account culture, we've realised that, and psychiatrists are starting to do questionnaires to take this into account when diagnosing individuals. And finally, there can be exceptions to the rule, so often it's not the best method to use when we're deciding whether someone is normal or abnormal, because we can miss people and misinterpret their behaviours. Our next and our final definition of abnormality is deviation from ideal mental health. So again, you might want to pause this and make some notes. So deviation from ideal mental health. There's a set of criteria that you must meet to have ideal mental health. So you can see that these are on the PowerPoint. So we've got self-attitudes, personal growth and self-actualization, integration, autonomy, accurate perception of reality and mastery of the environment. So for someone to be functioning normally and have good mental health, they have to meet all of these criteria. So you have to have high self-esteem, and you have to be able to develop to your full potential, you have to be able to cope with stressful situations, you have to be able to regulate your own emotions, you must have an accurate perception of reality, so understand kind of like, if someone's suffering from bipolar, often they won't have an accurate perception of reality. They'll have really high highs and really low lows. They might kind of like overreact and find something like extremely funny when actually in reality it's not as funny. And that could be because of their bipolar. They're just going up to that really extreme behaviour, and they're having a misperception of what's actually happening in reality. I think there's a really good clip from an episode of Friends, and Phoebe's got a boyfriend and he just finds everything really, really funny, and he's just like constantly happy all of the time. It's kind of like he sees something and it's like, oh my god, that's amazing, when in reality it's not that amazing. It's just something that happens daily. So if you can find that clip, have a little look. It's really it really shows you what accurate perception of reality means. And then we've got mastery of the environment. So this is the idea that you can have functioning relationships, you can adjust to new situations, and you're capable of solving problems. And if someone doesn't meet all of these criteria, then they might have a mental illness. People who, so I've got a couple of pictures there, I've got Robert Downey Jr. and Lindsay Lohan. So often people who struggle to cope with stressful situations, or they don't have high self-esteem, they find it really difficult to have successful relationships with individuals. They might turn to drugs or alcohol and develop an addiction, and this addiction can be a product of them having a mental health problem, but often we don't make that correlation. So what you need to remember for ideal mental health is the 6 criteria. So that's attitudes, actualization, integration, autonomy, perception, and mastery of the environment. I spelled attitudes wrong, so I do apologise for that. Your example of deviation from ideal mental health is more of a scenario than an example. So we've got a scenario here, we've got Sarah, who's attracted to men that are older than her, but her relationships never last long. She's constantly moving on to a new relationship, and this is making her feel anxious and depressed. So if you've looked at some bits in attachment, you might be able to link that to this, and Bowlby's theory of monotropy, that might link to this quite well. But just have a little look at Sarah and just have a look at the criteria for ideal mental health and see if you can decide which criteria she isn't meeting. So just pause the video, have a go at that question, and then I'll talk you through it. Okay, so if we're thinking about Sarah, her relationships never last long, so she isn't really mastering her environment, she isn't having successful relationships, she's feeling anxious and depressed. Maybe this anxiety and depression could link to her having low self-esteem, and that could be a reason why her relationships don't last long. Also, let's have a little look back. If we think as well, she might not be very good at self-regulating her emotions, and this could be why she's constantly moving on to new relationships. Okay? So that'll be similar to something that you'll get in the exam. So in the exam you'll get a scenario, and then you'll be asked to link that to maybe like certain parts of ideal mental health or different definitions of abnormality. So finally we've got to evaluate ideal mental health. So there's 3 things that we need to consider, and again, pause the video, take some notes, but I'll talk through it. So first of all, achieving the criteria. It's really hard for someone who is well to meet those criteria, and the criteria kind of contradict themselves, because in order for you to master your environment, sometimes you have to learn. So you'll be revising for your exams at some point, and that's a very stressful situation. And sometimes you might not cope in that situation, but by not coping in that situation, you learn to cope in future situations. So sometimes you have to not meet a criteria to actually meet a final criteria, so to sort of like reach your full potential and self-actualize, sometimes you have to fail. Sometimes you have to not be able to cope with stressful situations. Sometimes you have to learn how to master your environment in order for you to kind of like move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs links really well to ideal mental health as well. Then we've got cultural relativism. So this is a common theme throughout lots of the definitions of abnormality. So what we see as ideal mental health differs across cultures. So just like failure to function, collectivist and individualistic cultures have very, very different ways of working. One's very supportive, the other's very individualistic. So someone from a collectivist culture might find it very difficult to integrate and to cope with those stressful situations on their own. They might need support from other people, whereas someone from an individualistic culture would potentially find that quite easy. But someone from an individualistic culture might struggle with developing relationships with other individuals because they're not really used to working together as a collective, whereas someone from a collectivist culture would be quite good with that. So the criteria aren't really appropriate for all cultures, and that's something that we need to take into account. And then the final one is there is a big difference between physical health and mental health. So if we just have ideal mental health as a checklist, and we have someone coming into us, and we just kind of like go through and tick off whether they meet these criteria or not and use that to diagnose someone, sometimes that's not appropriate, because when we're thinking about mental illness, it's far more complex than that. It's not just you meeting these criteria, there's lots of other factors that we need to take into account. You could be meeting all of these criteria on the surface, but actually in reality you're really suffering from something else, because you're really good at hiding it, and you show in day-to-day life, you're kind of like put on a face and you show that you can cope with stressful situations, but then you go home and have a breakdown. So sometimes using these criteria is not really appropriate. So we need to remember when we're evaluating ideal mental health that the criteria are hard to meet, and people who have good mental health often do not meet all of the criteria. The criteria are bound by culture, so we need to take into account someone's cultural background if we are using these criteria to diagnose that person. And finally, it's hard to use in real life because mental health isn't as straightforward as using a tick list and checking off to decide whether someone is suffering from something or not. Okay, so to finish up, what I'd like you to do is read these exam questions, pause this, write your answers down. So you've got 9 marks worth of questions there, should take you about 10-11 minutes, and then I'll talk through what you should have as your answers to the questions, or what your answers should include. Okay, so the first question. Abnormality can be defined as a failure to function adequately. Outline and evaluate this definition of abnormality. So we'll go as a straightforward 3 marks for your outline, 3 for your evaluation. So for your outline, you need to include this idea that someone is failing to cope with everyday life. That would be your first mark. And then you'd have to elaborate on that. So give an example. So for example, someone who is suffering from depression may find it difficult to get out of bed in the morning. Okay? Or someone who is suffering from an eating disorder may find it difficult to eat their daily meals. Then your evaluation. So you can include any of the evaluation points that we've discussed previously. So the idea of cultural relativism, the idea that someone has to judge what is adequate, and the idea that there could be exceptions to the rule, so it's not always the most appropriate method to use. The second question, we've got Diane. She's a 30-year-old businesswoman, and when she doesn't get her own way, she has a temper tantrum. She attended her grandmother's funeral and laughed during the prayers, and when she talks to people, she gets very close to them and makes them feel uncomfortable. So you just have to identify one definition and explain your choice. So you could use either of the definitions from today's lesson, or one of the definitions from yesterday's lesson. So from yesterday's lesson you could use deviation from social norms, and you could link that to the idea that she's standing very close to people and she's making them feel uncomfortable. So it's an unusual behaviour, and we used like rudeness as our example, and this is quite similar to that. So she's going against the norms in society. And then when we think about her having a temper tantrum, you could link that to ideal mental health. The idea that she's not integrating, she's not managing her stress very well. So she can't, you could also link that to self-actualization. She's not going to be able to reach her full potential if she's having temper tantrums at the age of 30. And then her grandmother's funeral, again you could link that to deviation from social norms, because that's something that's not seen as a normal behaviour. You might see that that's something that's quite worrying. Yeah, okay, so have a little look through your answers. If you've got anything different and you want me to check it, then please just attach it to the assignment and send that in to me, and I'll check your answer for you and I'll give you a mark if you're unsure what mark you should get. So for the last question, you get 1 mark for your definition, and then your other 2 marks are linking your definition to the item and explaining why that links. Okay? So finally what I'd like you to do is go back on Classroom and complete the quiz for this lesson, and that's our first topic of psychopathology, definitions of abnormality, completed. Thank you.